Hi, everybody. Welcome back. How was lunch? Good? Good. All right, we're going to start the session with a few announcements, and then we'll get into the awesome speakers we have here. First, there's a group of your colleagues interested in vetting a new USASBE special interest group, Entrepreneurship at Smaller Colleges and Universities. As the opportunities and challenges of developing entrepreneurship programs at smaller schools are often on a different scale and/or focus than the larger institutions, this special interest group is interested in sharing and disseminating information and best practices in smaller settings. So if you are like Goldilocks and found that you just haven't found that special interest group that fits just right, I think that's a porridge comment, please come up to the Fisher Colloquium, which is just on the floor above, at the 2:30 break after the session, if you'd like to meet others like you and to learn more. Secondly, is there a Richard Lester in the room? Richard, please stand up. No? Well, when Richard comes in, we have his notebook. You want a prize. Now to get on to our speakers. Our first speaker this afternoon is Sean Greene. He's the Associate Administrator for Investment and the Special Advisor for Innovation at the U.S. Small Business Administration. He's responsible for both the Small Business Investment Company program with approximately $16 billion of assets under management, as well as the Small Business Investment Research Program, one of the government's largest innovation programs, which provides over $2 billion of research and development funding to small businesses each year. He also leads the SBA's effort focused on stimulating high-growth entrepreneurship and has been one of the leaders in the administration's Startup America initiative.
Thank you. Great to be here. It reminds me, it made me feel like I was back in business school, actually, because I had one professor who knew everyone in the class, and if somebody was late, he would always call on that person first and say, oh, Richard Lester, you're not here, you're not here. So it sounds like you're using the exact same tactics to make sure people show up on time, and I like that. And I also remember that it was always the troublemakers, including myself, who would sit at the back of the class. So I don't know if that's still the case, but it seems like we're heavily skewed in the back. So I was given the unenviable task of speaking after lunch. And I remember when I was in college, I had a class on the symphony. Yes, I worked hard in college, right after lunch in a room that was always too hot. And at any given moment, half the class was asleep. So if I see folks nodding off, I just may speak louder, right, and jolt you into being awake. So I have a great job. I come into the federal government as somebody who's been an entrepreneur. I had once worked at McKinsey, but don't hold that against me. Had been an entrepreneur and had been a seed stage investor. So I bring a lifelong passion of being and helping entrepreneurs in the private sector to the federal government. And I have a great job because fundamentally what I'm trying to do is bring more entrepreneurial and innovative approaches to how the federal government helps entrepreneurs and innovators. And I want to start by really just defining or using a definition of entrepreneur that I think for me really sums it all up, which is an entrepreneur is someone who does more than anyone thought possible with far less than what everyone thought necessary. And I think it's just a great kind of grounding concept that I'll come back to a little bit later. But what I'd like to talk to you about today is really three things. One is why focusing on entrepreneurship and why care about entrepreneurship. Second, to talk a little bit about what the Obama administration and the federal government has done to stimulate entrepreneurship, and particularly high-growth entrepreneurship. And then third, put it back a little bit more to you with some concrete challenges for the role that all of you can play in stimulating innovation and entrepreneurship throughout the country. So as a starting point, again, I'm assuming most of you know the numbers, right? If you look at job creation in the economy, first of all, half of the jobs in the economy are in small businesses. But when you're looking at net new job creation, the vast majority comes from small businesses. Now, I say vast majority because there have been a handful of different academic studies who slice and dice the data a different way. But all the studies say the same thing. And whether it's 2/3 or virtually all of the research shows that the bulk of net new job creation comes from small business and entrepreneurs. And in particular, it's disproportionately concentrated in a smaller number of firms that we call high growth companies. And so if we're looking to create jobs in this economy, doing everything that we can to help those entrepreneurs is critically important. Now, it's also important to note that all of the data shows, including Kaufman just released another study on this week, that all of those companies, aren't just in Silicon Valley or in Boston. And it's not just, two white male engineers in a garage in Palo Alto. They are in all industries, and they're all across the country. So as we're looking and saying that we've got to take action, we have to address that fact and look for opportunities to strengthen entrepreneurial ecosystems. So while this is important, the challenges facing entrepreneurs in this economic environment are obviously pretty meaningful. You've probably seen the data. There's been a 26% decline in terms of the number of new startups that are created each year, kind of post-financial crisis. McKinsey estimates that translates into 1.8 million jobs lost as a result of the decline of the rate of startup. In addition, there's been a market increase in the failure rate of startups. Nobody's quantified that as well. And again, I'm sure you're seeing all the challenges, right? So access to capital, right? The venture capital market's down. Some people say the venture market's broken. The public markets are closed. Angel investing is down. Bootstrapping opportunities like piggybacking your credit card or your HELOC aren't available. So challenges on the capital side, challenges on finding customers, lots and lots of challenges facing entrepreneurs right at the time that we need them most. So before I throw too much doom and gloom at you, kind of a couple of bright notes that I want to put out. First, I'll ask a question. Research has shown, guess which decade in the last century had the highest levels of innovative activity, defined as total factor productivity growth for all the economists in the room? Somebody, give me a decade. Somebody said it. The 1930s. So it was actually during the Great Depression, when times were incredibly tough. And we saw, critical advances in the internal combustion engine, the invention of Teflon, the creation of Krispy Kreme donuts, things that have been critical to the progress of the country, in the 1930s, at a time when things were incredibly challenging. So a different question. This time I'll do it Jeopardy style. I'll give you the answer, and you guys have to state the question. 57%. The troublemakers are now in the middle of the room. Okay, that's innovation, right? 57% is the percentage of Fortune 500 companies that were actually started during a recession or an economic downturn. So, this mindset of, hey, when the going gets tough, the entrepreneurs get going. And so what we've been focusing on within the administration and working closely with our colleagues in Congress is saying, hey, particularly at this time, we need to be doing everything that we can to help entrepreneurs. And when I talk about high growth entrepreneurship, all kinds of different definitions, but at its simplest, it's companies who are small now, but who have the aspirations and the capabilities to ultimately be big. And so our mindset is we need an all hands on deck approach to helping entrepreneurs. By all hands, we need to say it's not just government, let's partner with the private sector. And I know the Startup America Partnership folks were here today. And when we launched Startup America, we initially started with that mindset of let's create a private sector organization that can get off to the races. But within the government, we've got to do everything we can to Startup America. So let's work public-private. Let's work across all agencies within the federal government. So this is an SBA's job, et cetera. And most fundamentally, before we start even talking about programs and policies, we have to take a mindset of celebrating entrepreneurship and leveraging the power of the federal government as a convener to bring together different parties to take action. And somebody, I think it was Steve Case at the time, said that, hey, when somebody wins the NCAA football championship, they get invited to the White House. Why don't we do that for entrepreneurs? And so I'm proud to say that in the last 12 months alone on that issue of celebration, I've been to at least 24 events at the White House focusing on engaging with entrepreneurs or other folks in the entrepreneurial startup system. And it's immensely gratifying when the State of the Union comes around, and each of the last 2 years, there's been an entrepreneur who's actually been a recipient of one of the programs that I'm responsible for, who's been invited to sit with the First Lady in the box watching the State of the Union. So I'll switch to the programs in a minute, but I don't want to underestimate the power of just that celebration of entrepreneurship and the role that that can play nationally. So one of the first things we did in the Startup America effort was to say, hey, why don't we get out, and if we're trying to say what can the federal government do, let's actually listen to our customers. You know, again, a radical notion, get out of Washington and listen to people. And so we went out and we had roundtables around the country. We're talking to entrepreneurs, investors, other folks in the ecosystem with a simple question. What barriers are you facing to growing your company and creating jobs? And what are concrete things that we can do to help? And we got fantastic ideas, fantastic ideas. And here are the kind of barriers that we heard about: challenges in capital. We heard about challenges getting customers. We heard about challenges with people and getting the right people and skill sets on board. We heard about challenges with ideas and IP. And then finally, we heard a lot about challenges in interacting with the government. Not about regulations, by the way. As I talk to entrepreneurs, very few would say, hey, regulations are a problem. When they're asked by a pollster, are regulations a problem, they'd say yes. But when they said, what specific problems? What I actually heard a lot more of was, hey, government's too slow, or it doesn't move fast enough, or it's not as flexible as it needs to be. And so it's not just what government does, but how government interacts that can be problematic as well. So I'm really pleased to say, you know, a year and a half after doing these kind of listening sessions, the list of actions that we've actually taken have been pretty impressive, right? So let me kind of just check off, and let's see if I can actually remember all these things without looking at my notes. So in the Capitol, huge set of issues. Everybody in the room knows it. You know, within SBA, our small business lending programs hit record years last year in terms of how much capital we helped facilitate through banks. The Small Business Investment Company platform that I'm responsible for, which is a fund of funds providing more longer-term growth capital into entrepreneurs. In 2010, we also hit a record year in the 50-year history of the program. And then 2011, we took it up another 50%. And we closed our fiscal last Friday. Third year in a row, we hit record years. And in addition to that, we've launched new programs like a $1 billion fund to go for early stage innovative funds who are outside of Silicon Valley, Boston, and New York, right, to get capital to early stage entrepreneurs, which is a huge gap in the market right now. So in addition to these big programs, we've done 17 different tax cuts for small businesses. And a huge success recently is the Jobs Act. Again, working with both sides of the aisle in Congress to pass a really important piece of legislation I assume most of you know about that includes both concrete steps to open up IPO markets, as well as launching innovative new platforms like crowdfunding to help kind of the bootstrapping entrepreneurs, you know, democratize investment and let businesses raise equity capital from customers, from members of their community, et cetera, et cetera. So really good progress on the capital side. Similarly, on the people side, lots of challenges, but good progress, right? So immigration, huge issue that we've heard from entrepreneurs, and there are and a lot of the big changes in immigration will require legislative changes. But in the interim, we've taken action as well administratively. So for instance, many of you may know the OPT program, which allows people in STEM fields to stay, you know, post-PhD for another additional 17 months in the country. We've more than doubled the number of fields that qualify for that program, including neuroscience, including computer science, including math. So taking an existing program, being a little bit more expansive with it, allowing more people to stay. Similar things for entrepreneurs who want to come to the US to start a company and create jobs. We've made changes in the EB-2 program. So administrative tweaks that can have big ramifications. Also on the people side, we've done things with mentoring programs. And whether those are targeted groups like returning vets, who, by the way, index really high on entrepreneurship, but targeted mentoring programs to help returning vets kind of launch and create a small business. Other things on the people, you know, similar mentoring programs supporting regional economic clusters and other efforts that are kind of looking out, seeing programs working effectively in your communities, and really just looking and saying, how can we kind of put more gas in the engine of these efforts and help take them to the next level? Thirdly, in the ideas bucket, America invents, fundamental reform of the U.S. patent system, the biggest overhaul of patents, in decades. Embedded in that are things like a fast track program that will allow small businesses to get patents faster. And in addition to the big legislative change, again, smaller tweaks. So the Department of Energy, as an example, ran a competition called America's Next Great Energy Innovator that opened up federal labs and significantly lowered the costs for startup and small businesses to license technology from federal labs at almost no cost. So again, big picture legislative changes, small targeted tweaks as well. On the customer side, so one of the things I very frequently heard from entrepreneurs as we traveled around the country is, yeah, the lending, the investment programs, those are one things, but what I really need is customers, right? And wow, I'd love the federal government as a customer. So my initial reaction is, ooh, changing federal procurement, that's not gonna happen in my lifetime. But what we did here was, you know what, just pay me faster, right? And, so when we tell journalists about this, they're like, why, what does that matter? I'm like, okay, never mind, this little thing called cash flow. So the president issued an executive order to pay all small businesses in 15 days. Huge potential change. And so we also said, okay, get a wind under our belt. Now back to the not in my lifetime. Actually, no, we are going back. And we're tackling the issue of federal procurement for startups with a beta that we're launching called RFP-EZ, right? And the whole idea is lower the transaction costs for startups selling to federal government. And particularly in IT, again, having come from the private sector where we've seen IT costs go down by 5x or 10x, that hasn't happened in the federal government. Here we've got a huge win-win to meaningfully reduce the cost to taxpayers and at the same time build a customer base for the most innovative startups in the IT space. So the final kind of set of things are coming back to this notion of lean government and changing how the federal government works. So one concrete example, coming back to the SBIC program, focusing on timelines. Again, within the federal government, historically, timelines don't matter. They do to the private sector. And so the reason we were able to accomplish those record years that I talked about before were because we took the average time it took SBA to license a new fund from 15 months down to 5.5. Similarly, one of the ideas that we got from somebody was saying, you want the government to be more entrepreneurial? Get more entrepreneurs in the federal government. So we've launched an entrepreneur in residence program called the Presidential Innovation Fellows Program. We had 18 slots for entrepreneurs to work on 5 targeted projects. We had 800 people apply to those slots. So it's changing how we as the federal government think about doing business. Now he's holding up the clock telling me how much time I have, so I'm just not gonna look over there, right? I'm just gonna keep looking over at this part of the audience. I kind of went through those things quickly, but what I'm trying to say is look at, through a range of things, whether it's little tweaks in regs, whether it's big existing programs, or working with the folks on the Hill, there's been an all-out effort and an all-hands-on-deck effort to do everything that we can to help these entrepreneurs. So with that in mind, I want to kind of turn it back to you guys and issue a set of challenges to the folks in the room, right? I saw a Kaufman data point that said 40% of Americans between ages 8 and 24 someday want to start a small business, right? They don't know when. So you have in front of you, an incredible talent base with an explicit desire to do something entrepreneurial. And you have an opportunity to teach these kids that not only should they think about getting a job, but they should be thinking about creating a job, right? And so the first challenge, but teaching that, building that in is not easy, I get that. So the first thing I see is I think conferences like this are great because you can share best practices, you can learn from each other. So the first challenge I want to throw to you is for each of you to simply take one thing that you learned from this conference and go back and implement it. Because I've been to 7,000 conferences in my life that I get all excited, I'm scribbling notes, I'm all energized, and as soon as I leave the conference and get back home and have 7,000 emails and all kinds of other things, and I forget it, take one thing that you've learned here and go back to your university and implement it. A second thought is one of the things that I've heard over and over again as I've traveled around the country is I see a big disconnect between what's happening in universities and entrepreneurship centers in universities and what's happening in the startup ecosystems in the communities in which you live. And that just can't be. You need to connect better to the accelerators, the angel investors, the entrepreneurs, and find ways to work more closely together. So the second challenge I have for you is something that I like to think of as listen, act, repeat. You've probably all heard that the 3 most powerful marketing words ever used in history were lather, rinse, repeat, right? Because it doubled the size of the shampoo market overnight. Well, maybe not for me. But that's what we did in the Startup America effort. We started by listening. Then we said, let's take some targeted actions. Now let's do it all over again. So connect with the folks in your ecosystems. And again, listen, act, and repeat. And we're looking at some ways and some platforms that hopefully can do kind of bottom-up idea generation to help facilitate that. More to come later on that, but stay tuned. The third challenge is for each of you to take a more entrepreneurial approach to teaching entrepreneurship, right? And I know what you're thinking, oh, in a university, that's really hard. I've got all these challenges. You don't know what, you don't know how hard it is. Look, I work for the federal government, right? If we can make it work, I'm going to rip off New York, New York. If we can make it work here, we can make it work anywhere, right? And if we can think more like a lean startup, so can't you. And when did you ever think that federal government and lean startup would be used in the same sentence, right? But if we can make it happen, and I know you all have budget challenges. So do we, right? I know you're worried about silos and the engineering school doesn't talk to the business school. Well, have you ever seen a federal government org chart? I know you have concerns about the internal politics of your university. What do you think happens here, right? So despite that, how can you be more entrepreneurial? And so with that, I'll issue a final challenge, which comes back to precisely the definition that I led off with of the entrepreneur. So the challenge is for each of you to do more than anyone thinks possible with far less than everyone thinks is necessary. So in that, oh, look at that timing. I hit it right on the nose. So with that, I will just throw out my email address. If anybody wants to follow up, it's Sean, S-E-A-N, .Greene, Greene like the color with an E at the end. We're the fancy branch of the Greene family, at sba.gov.
Wow, that was probably the most stimulating government presentation I've ever heard, including from my government professors. Now I'd like to welcome our final 2 speakers of the plenary session, Neeta Bidwai and Jason Wiens. Neeta is a senior policy advisor to the office of Senator Mark Warner, a Democrat of Virginia. She's responsible for policy related to telecommunications, technology, competitiveness, and trade. She also supports the senator's work as a member of the Senate Commerce Committee. Jason is a senior legislative assistant to the office of Senator Jerry Moran, Republican from Kansas. He's been with the senator for 8 years upon graduating from Northwestern University in 2004. His focus is on small business entrepreneurship. Welcome.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and it's a pleasure to be here, although after hearing the best presentation by a government official, we have a big challenge now. It's only downhill from here. Let me get this to our first slide. Let's see. Okay, so we just heard a lot of good information from Sean about what the administration is doing to support entrepreneurs here in Washington, D.C. and across the country. Neeta and I want to talk about an effort that our bosses, Senator Moran and Senator Warner, started last summer to try and get Capitol Hill focused on things that the Congress could do, changes we can make to law that would encourage entrepreneurship and make it easier for new businesses to grow more quickly. It all started really for Senator Moran with a report that the Kauffman Foundation issued last July. And it contained a few very important data points that I want to highlight. First, the Kauffman Foundation found that between 1980 and 2005, nearly all of the net new jobs that were created in the U.S. economy were created by companies less than 5 years old. The Kauffman Foundation data showed that what's really important is not necessarily the size of the business, but it's the age, and it's the new companies that are the real source of job creation in the U.S. economy. And if you look at the chart, you'll see that only in 4 periods in that 25-year span did the existing firms, the older firms, actually create more jobs than were lost in those companies. The second important point that came out of work that the Kauffman Foundation did that really kind of struck the senator was that new businesses create an average of 3 million new jobs every year. This data goes back to 1977. And the implication, I think, from both these points is pretty clear, that if we want to see a strengthening U.S. economy, a lower unemployment rate, more jobs created, we need to focus on ways in Washington where we can kind of unleash that power of entrepreneurship so more entrepreneurs can start a business. And again, as I said earlier, so those businesses can grow more quickly. I would say that these 2 data points are kind of the good news, but there was a little bit of bad news in the data that the Kauffman Foundation released last summer. And that is that, one, in 2010, the 394,000 new businesses that were started in the United States, this was the lowest number of any new businesses started in a year since 1977. Also, if you look at the chart, you'll see the last few bar graphs, they're on a downward slope. And since 2006, the number of jobs that startups created in a year has been on a decline. The 2.3 million jobs that were created in 2010 were the 3rd fewest number of jobs created by startups in a year since the beginning of the data set in 1977. So with that data in hand, and recommendations from the Kauffman Foundation and from others who have studied this topic of entrepreneurship, Senator Moran got together with Senator Warner. They sat down last fall and had a series of conversations. The result of those conversations was a bill that we introduced in the Senate in December last year, S. 1965, a bill that we called the Startup Act. The intent of our bill was to, again, figure out ways, some common sense changes that Congress can make that would make it easier for entrepreneurs to start a business. After that bill was introduced, our bosses met with a handful of other members in the Senate. More conversations took place, and this May, we introduced kind of a reworked version of that initial bill, which we call Startup Act 2.0. And we introduced that legislation with a bipartisan group of members, Senator Marco Rubio from Florida, Senator Chris Coons from Delaware, Roy Blunt from Missouri, and Scott Brown from Massachusetts. Just about a month after that piece of legislation was introduced in the Senate, in June, a bipartisan group of members in the House of Representatives introduced an identical bill. That bill number, H.R. 5893, has 24 bipartisan co-sponsors, 12 Republicans, 12 Democrats. So not only do we have a bipartisan, bicameral, meaning in the House and the Senate, group of members of Congress who are supportive of these ideas to encourage entrepreneurship, but there's a lot of support also off the Hill for what we're trying to do in Congress. For example, President Obama's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness issued a series of recommendations, many of which align very closely with what we do in Startup Act 2.0. Sean mentioned the President's State of the Union address and the presence of entrepreneurs there with the First Lady. This year, the President in his State of the Union address said to Congress, "Send me an agenda that helps startups and small businesses succeed." The next day, Senator Moran and Senator Warner wrote to the President and said, "We've got a bill that does just that. It's called the Startup Act. We encourage your support of this." We didn't pass that bill yet in Congress, but Sean did mention the Jobs Act, which is, again, kind of in the same space of things that we can do that make it easier for entrepreneurs to do what they do best. As you know, we're a month away from the presidential election. Governor Romney has also expressed support for a lot of the ideas in the Startup Act. And so I think this is something that our bosses are both really proud of, that in a time in which there doesn't seem to be a lot of cooperation in Washington, D.C., we're able to bring Republicans and Democrats together all around this idea of how do we support entrepreneurs. Let me just talk about a few more things, and then I'll hand it over to Neeta. Just quickly, I wanted to show that there's also support from leading technology groups, businesses that are very large now that just a few years ago were startups, chambers of commerce across the country for this bill. So now let's talk about what does this bill actually do? And it addresses 4 kind of key areas that are important to entrepreneurs. As you know, entrepreneurs, they need a good idea, they need talented employees, they need capital, and they need an environment that fosters growth, and we attempt to address each of those 4 areas in the bill. So let me talk first about the issue of talent. In our legislation, we provide new opportunities for highly skilled, educated entrepreneurial immigrants to stay in the United States, where their talent and new ideas can fuel economic growth. We do a few things in particular. One, we eliminate what's called the per-country caps on employment-based visas that currently are a hindrance to U.S. employers recruiting the top-tier talent they need. Second, we create a STEM visa for up to 50,000 foreign students who graduate from an American university with a master's or PhD in science, technology, engineering, or math. Take a look at the chart. As you know, you work at universities across the country. We educate here in the United States at our universities some of the best and brightest from around the world. We want, though, to keep or to give these skilled individuals who have been educated in the United States an opportunity to stay here if they want and to put their skills to use to help our economy grow. Looking at the chart, you'll see, for example, this shows master's and doctorate degrees in computer science, engineering, and math that were awarded in 2009 to foreign students. That year we had 53,000 from India alone, 31,000 from China. Unfortunately, our current policies force many of these students to return home to their home countries. We'd like to change that. Allowing more foreign graduates of American universities to stay here in the United States will provide the young growing companies with the talented workers that they need to grow. In addition, we believe it will also result in new business creation. Here's a stat from the Kauffman Foundation that shows that 25% of the engineering and technology firms that were founded in the United States were founded by foreign-born entrepreneurs between 1995 and 2005. In addition, there's data from the Partnership for a New American Economy that shows immigrants with advanced STEM degrees from American universities create jobs for Americans. For every 100 STEM graduates from an American university, the result is about 262 American jobs. So this is a good thing even for American workers. And then this will be, I think, the last stat I wanted to share before I hand it over to Neeta. But again, from the Partnership for a New American Economy, I found this statistic troubling. They project that just in 6 short years, the United States will face a projected shortfall of 223,000 qualified advanced degree STEM workers. A quick story, I guess, to kind of illustrate this point. Senator Moran was in Silicon Valley this spring, and he met with a large company that was trying to hire, they needed 68 talented, highly skilled employees. They couldn't find Americans to do the work, unfortunately. They had plans to hire foreigners through the H-1B visa program, but the cap was met before they were able to bring those people to the United States. So they didn't just not hire them, they hired them, but they put them at a location in Canada. And that's a situation that we want to try and avoid, where these talented workers that are going to fuel growth at companies here in the United States, we want to keep them here so that they can contribute to our economy rather than another. And now I'll turn it over to Neeta.
Thanks, Jason. Picking up where Jason left off, another portion of the bill focuses on a second type of visas, which we targeted to entrepreneurs, and it's similar in some ways to the existing EB-5 program, if some of you are familiar with it. But I think both of our senators and those who've supported us felt like there were ample opportunities and examples of folks that we want creating new companies and bringing new jobs to the U.S. And so this is something that we've also focused on in this legislation. The next slide talks a little bit about some more of the statistics. I think that this is really representative of the American dream, the fact that almost half of the Fortune 500 companies that we have are founded by immigrants or their children. And as the child of immigrants herself, I think that's a particularly important statistic to many of us in this country. And it also speaks to what you can do in the U.S., which is something that has made it incredibly unique over the history of this nation. Some of the great examples too, because I think people forget when you are thinking about startups that they're not always tech companies. Some of them are, and some of these are some of the greatest successes of the new economy. But others are capstone, blue chip companies, McDonald's, GE, AT&T. And it's been interesting, and I think it also speaks to the point that Jason talked about, which is if you look at a company like AT&T, they've grown over time, they've been able to innovate, but their innovation may in some ways be a bit different than some of the new start companies, because I think that as many of you who've studied this topic recognize, scale brings a number of advantages to market, but it also possibly makes you a little less risk averse than you might have been when you were scrappy and working out of someone's garage or in a basement. So we think there's a wide ecosystem of great American success stories that came out of startups and out of the contributions of foreign-born immigrant entrepreneurs. We also talk a little bit, and Sean had alluded to some of this as well. There is certainly a debate going on in the political world and in the policy world about regulatory benefits and costs. And I think that regardless of what your position is on regulations kind of writ large, there is certainly a question about value. There are regulations and laws that bring great value to our lives. We have clean air, we have clean water. Those are things that we take for granted, and it's easy to forget that those are directly related to successful regulations in many ways. But I think both Senator Warner and Senator Moran feel like absent some assessment of value going forward, it's not as if we can continue to just add regulatory burdens without really thinking about what's the most effective and efficient way to both require high standards from companies, but also try to make the burden for compliance as manageable as possible. So that's something that we've sought to address partially in the bill. We also, and I was telling Jason we needed Virginia and Kansas up here instead of the states we've got. But one of the other factors, and certainly to Senator Warner, who was had the good fortune to be governor of Virginia before coming to the Senate, I think that the question of how federal regulatory policies intersect and interact with state laws is a really important issue, and we've tried in this legislation to really look at kind of the state of regulatory benefits, and also other types of state laws which can encourage investment and also hopefully can provide states with different ideas about how to perhaps make it easier for companies to invest and to grow in their states. We also, have done a lot of work here, and this was something that Senator Coons in particular, really took the leadership role in developing this for Startup 2.0, and that's the R&D credit, which, as many of you know, is one of the great American success stories. The U.S. was the first country to have an R&D credit, and today I think almost any tech company in this country and biotech and others, it's easy to take it for granted now. And yet, if you're in one of these companies, you know that other nations have caught up. They are investing, they are doing very aggressive work with their own R&D credits. And so we have two challenges, and one is extending, renewing, the existing credit, which I think both of our bosses support. But the other point is the way that the R&D credit is currently structured, it's a little difficult for startup companies. I mean, effectively, we really haven't been able to find any good examples of startups that have been able to benefit from the R&D credit. And yet, if we look at innovative businesses, many of them are research-driven. And so this is an effort on our part to try to tailor an expansion of the credit, which would hopefully be of benefit to startup companies. The other thing that we do here is we talk a bit about tax policy, and I think that one of the, sorry, I'll catch up with my notes here. One of the kind of, I would say, depressing points of fact over recent years has been the investment in new businesses. There have been a couple statistics that came out this summer that were released by the National Science Board. It's the governing body for NSF. And they noted that back in 2000, there was about $43 billion being invested by venture capital firms in select science and technology industries. That number in 2010 was down to $10 billion. For private equity, the number in 2005, just 5 years ago, was $60 billion, and that was down to about $15 billion in 2010. So we feel like the data points in the private sector are a little bit discouraging in terms of encouraging capital, and we are hopeful that rewarding investors for longer-term investments in startup companies, which are riskier, can hopefully bring some great benefit to both those startups and to jobs, and also to the investors. We also have talked a good bit about commercialization and technology transfer, and there's a section of the bill which seeks to maybe start a new conversation about how to enhance innovation and commercialization capacity within universities. There's a great range of success stories among American universities, and many of you in this room are probably well aware. But there are also some stories about, there may be some room for additional growth and new ideas, and we see this as a real challenge where we may be able to provide some funding to help those universities that seek to do more than what they're doing today. We might have a chance to help them grow. And it's important to us, and I know Senator Warner always talks about the fact that when Bayh-Dole was passed, it was an incredibly innovative idea. This concept that government didn't own intellectual property and that it belonged to taxpayers and to universities was, just revolutionary. But I think that to just rely on the success of Bayh-Dole and to say there's nothing more we can do to kind of keep the dialogue going and to really push both universities and the companies with which they partner, is maybe limiting us. So that's another provision that we've included in this bill. And then this statistic, which is also one of our more depressing ones, we seek to have a positive message, but some of the data points are, we feel like they encourage you to look at why legislation like the Startup Act would be, very valuable. These are data points from the World Bank, and they show the declining place of the U.S. in terms of some of the innovation metrics, which unfortunately, it's sad to see, and we hope it's a trend that Congress and the administration can reverse over time. So that's one of the things I think we really feel is a great reason to hopefully support the Startup Act. And to be able to work on bipartisan efforts. I know for Senator Warner in particular, I think one of the great success stories of his service as governor was his ability and his interest in working with Republicans in the legislature. And just as importantly, it was the interest of members of the other party that wanted to work with him. And I think that in the Senate, we've been fortunate to have a great partner in Senator Moran and in other colleagues who have invested a lot of time and effort thinking about how best to jumpstart innovation. So that's a little bit about the Startup Act. I don't know if we want to take questions, or are we good? Okay, great. I think we're good. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much to Jason and Neeta, as well as Sean. This is just about the end of our plenary sessions for today. A couple of more quick announcements. Is Richard Lester still skipping class? If anybody knows him, I guess we'll put this at the registration desk. Once again, repeat the announcement. If you do represent a small college or university and want to get together with your peers and learn from each other with a special interest group, you are invited to meet right after I finish talking in the conference lounge on the 4th floor. So after the break, we're going to start the breakout sessions. We have one session of breakout workshops that starts at 3:15, and those are going to be in various classrooms around the building. Hopefully you can find those easily. There are a lot of signs out there that should help. After that, we're going to have our regional breakout session. And this is the first time we've done this at GCEC. Our goal is relatively simple. It's to help you meet people that are from your part of the world, your part of the country, and see if there are ways you might want to collaborate. We do have some volunteer moderators in those rooms, and so hopefully they'll help you get to know each other well, and you'll make some new friends. After that, it's you get a little bit more of a break, and then it's time for the cocktail party and dinner. So maybe you can sit with some of your new regional friends at dinner. So with that, we'll close this session. Thank you once again to our speakers.